Hi, everyone. I had a few remarks I wanted to add based specifically on our discussion. First of all, I want to thank Mark, Lynn, Lisa, Kelsey, and Jennifer for setting a great example, providing a facilitation for a very lively discussion and a great summary. This is getting us definitely off on the right foot as we move forward into the next couple of discussions that we'll have. During our discussion on phenotypic plasticity, I read some responses that either indicated a misunderstanding to some degree of phenotypic plasticity or perhaps just a misuse of the language, so I thought I would clarify. One important aspect of phenotypic plasticity is that it deals with the phenotype, and in order to really truly understand that, you need to make sure you remember the difference between genotype and phenotype. So I'll elaborate just a little. Genotype is that genetic composition that the organism carries of its two different alleles. If you go back to your middle or high school biology and you remember the two letters that you use to describe genetic composition, that's the genotype, and that is what is passed down from the parents. The phenotype is how those genes present to the world, and so what we see as observable characteristics. And so here are some examples. We have the genotype of this moth is indicated either by the capital letters showing a dominant allele or the lowercase letters showing a recessive allele. And so we can see here that there are three different genotypes for this moth, but two phenotypes, dark or light. Another example that you see often in those intro to biology type textbooks is the genotype for blue eyes versus brown eyes. And again, you have those three genotypes, but the two phenotypes, the blue eyes or the brown eyes. And I know it's not quite that simple as we're starting to learn, but since it's an example we all hear when we're young, it's sometimes a nice reminder of the concept. We also have, here's an example of the phenotype being the smooth or the wrinkled peas, but you can see there are three different genotypes below there listed, as well as the phenotype or the observable trait of yellow and green peas and the three different genotypes. So plasticity is the ability to change. And when we're talking about phenotypic plasticity, we're talking about a change in the phenotype, which is, again, the observable characteristic. But in this case, we're having the genotype stay the same, which is different than the cases you saw just on the slide before. Often phenotypes are not plastic. That means that if you're going to see a different phenotype, it's because the genotype is also different. And so when we're talking about phenotypic plasticity, we're talking about something that's outside of those traditional inheritance patterns. And we're seeing the same genotype, but different ways for that genotype to be expressed. Here's a graph that kind of shows that difference. And so with no plasticity, we would expect any given trait to stay exactly the same as the environment changes. But in a plastic trait, we would see those traits expressed one way in one environment and an entirely different way in the other environment. And here's some examples of phenotypic plasticity in some organisms. Here's some insects that have a different size based on the temperature. And in this case, we're again looking at the same genotype in all of these flies, but a different expression of that gene. Here's an example with dandelions. The dandelions grow with a different phenotype. They grow with a different phenotype, even though their genotypes are the same. And so you can see the different environment and how it grows. Some of you might know the example of hydrangeas, whose color changes based on pH level of the soil. Unlike sunflowers, who have a different color based on their genes, hydrangeas' color changes in response to environment. So that would be another example of that phenotypic plasticity. This little critter is the caterpillar that belongs to the peppered moth. And again, genotype's the same, but the phenotype changes based on the type of plant it hangs out on and gets its food from. And here's another graphic that just kind of re-emphasizes this point that with phenotypic plasticity, we have a single genotype. So, two big A's or a big A and a little a, like we saw in that earlier slide. But depending on the environment, the way that that gene is expressed is different. And this echoes what Phil said in his video to you. We need to remember that plasticity itself is the trait, and not the phenotype. So the plasticity of that particular gene and the ability of that organism's traits to be different based on environment is a trait as well. And it's also a trait that's, like anything else, evolvable. Some other general comments that I wanted to add here had to do with some of the other discussions. A lot of us talked about surviving a changing climate, and just wanted to put that reminder out there that things do go extinct, and sometimes even without human intervention, we have mass extinctions. Now I know that there's evidence that suggests that our particular role in the current level of extinction is outside of the range of normal, barring some natural disaster. But it is important to realize that even during those mass extinctions, there is life that has always persisted. And usually those organisms have traits that make them make that environment favorable to them. And likely in any other form of mass extinction, that would happen as well. What those traits are is anyone's guess, and it's perfectly dependent upon the environment that arises as a result of that major climate change. And often it brings along a major change in the nature of life at that point. A good example of that is the mass extinction that resulted in the extinction of all the dinosaurs, ushering in what we call the age of mammals, where all of a sudden reptiles did not fill as many niches as we once saw, and mammals had an explosion of diversification. Some other things that were brought up that would be interesting to keep in mind as we move into other discussions were the role of non-natives or invasive species and the way that their unique ability to adapt and thrive in very different climates can cause problems for some organisms and help them to thrive. And another comment that was brought up in that same discussion had to do with the survival of an individual versus the survival of an ecosystem. And we see that balance being struck, or that question arising when we do see these explosions of non-native species in certain areas. Co-adaptation was a great discussion. There were so many really interesting relationships and critters that you all mentioned. Some things to think about as we bring up examples like that that are so cool is to always remember to explore the environmental pressures that may have spurred those relationships on, because as we come to evolution, we're always going to need to go back to the fact that environment drives adaptation. And especially those of you who plan to teach these ideas to our youngest kiddos, sometimes it's easy to forget the role of the environment in those cases, as we get so caught up in the wonder of all these really cool creatures. I was also interested in the conversation about synchronicity and how some of these organisms that are able to adapt or co-adapt, that are able to adapt would quickly, in result of a changing climate, would probably have an effect on those they have co-adapted with. Some other things to mention, and Phil mentioned this as well, nothing is perfectly adapted. Evolution is not a contest in the way that there is one specific perfect creature that everything is striving to be. It really has to do with filling a particular ecological niche and responding to the environment at hand. One potential misunderstanding that I saw as I was reading the discussions were about the nature of adaptation in human behavior. Now, certainly the ability of humans to, and the tendency of humans to come together as a group or to support one another, protect one another, care for our sick, our aging, or those of us who are in trouble is an adaptation, a behavioral adaptation that has allowed humans as a species to survive. A change in the way we behave in line with those same like grouping social adaptations is not necessarily an adaptation in and of itself. So some examples I saw about, you know, the ways that the humans living in New York during Hurricane Sandy or New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, different places during floods or earthquakes, kind of adapted by coming together and helping each other out. I don't know if that's necessarily an adaptation in that regard, but the fact that humans tend to do that and have tended to do that since we began living in social groups millions of years ago is an adaptation. And so be careful with that when we talk about just kind of changes in culture, changes in belief. Those might not necessarily be an evolutionary adaptation, but more of a cultural one. Oh, it looks like I'm done. So thank you.